Hello, and welcome to this, the first in the KismetKit series by UDKme. What I'm going to be doing in this series is showing you a whole bunch of different blocks of Kismet that you can use in your own mini-games or even full-fledged games. Although Kismet is generally used to create smaller interactions and do prototyping for larger games, it is possible to create whole games with it. And I'm going to give you the tools, or the building blocks shall we say, to accomplish just that. In some cases, you're going to be able to do things that people said it was only possible in Unreal Script. And yes, it's true. There are some things that we can't do in Kismet, but in many cases we can think outside the box a little bit, and that's just what we're going to do here with our first KismetKit video on how to create a top-down camera view. This is a very requested type of camera, and so I figured it would be a logical place to start. Then we'll move on, maybe do a couple of other types of cameras, and of course all the many other things that you can do in Kismet, including enemy interactions and so forth. In the end, I intend to give you enough building blocks to give you some fresh ideas at the very least, and who knows, maybe even build a whole game from these blocks. So in this first video we're going to be building a simpler version of this top-down camera. This camera only rotates on one axis, and it's very reminiscent of old Nintendo RPGs and such. When I say a simpler version, I mean we're only going to handle the setup of the camera, and not the player model, which is, although it might not look it, it's only a static mesh which has set up to be a mover. So let's begin. Alright, so we're now in our Kismet view of what I just showed you, which is our top-down camera. And the Kismet that we have here is actually a little bit more involved than that, because in most game types in the Unreal Development Kit, what happens is when you try to view your character pawn from an external camera, you won't see anything. And that's because there is no mesh assigned to your player. So what we need to do is attach a static mesh to our actor, and then we'll make the camera follow that around. So if you want to have just the very basic top-down camera, not all of these nodes are necessary, but I'll tell you what all of these do and which ones are necessary. We do need to have the matinee. That's what's going to actually point the camera at our player. We need at least one attached to actor node. We need the camera actor, and this is going to come from a camera that we actually physically place in the level. And this player 0, this is just a variable that we can find in Kismet, and we'll need to change some settings here. The player spawned is the event that actually makes all this happen. It doesn't need to be a player spawned, it could be a level loaded. We can start everything from beginning of level, but I've chosen the player spawn to be the event because, as I'll probably explain more later, when your character dies, sometimes this whole external camera thing can get stuck, and this kind of helps to avoid that. And we don't need this player start, this is just associated with the player spawned event. So really all we need is some sort of event to trigger all this to start. Otherwise nothing is going to happen. So let's review. We need some kind of event. In this case we'll go with level loaded. Then we need the attached to actor. And we only need the one that attaches the camera to the player. The one you see here that attaches the interp object or static mesh to the player isn't necessary. This is just a trick to make our player visible in certain game modes, and there are actually much more proper ways of doing that, which we'll be covering in further KismetKit lessons. Regardless of how complex we want to make this, what holds true is that any variable that we want involved in this sequence must have the ability to interpolate. Normally a static mesh doesn't. The player does. The camera does. And with an interp actor, the static mesh can too. The final piece of the puzzle is the matinee sequence, and that's what's going to point the camera to either the object or the player. So now I'm going to show you step by step how to do this from scratch. Start a new map, then at the top of the screen use the K icon to open the Kismet editor. The first thing that we're going to need is some kind of event, as I said. And for simplicity's sake, we're going to go with a level loaded event. What normally trips people up with third-person cameras is they see an action under camera called look at, but we're not going to use that. We're going to use matinee instead to get the camera to point to our player. Now, look at would seem straightforward, right? But as far as I know, at the moment it doesn't even function. Next, we need an attach to actor. So what's the attachment and what's the actor? The actor is the player that we want the camera to follow. That's us. So we need a player variable. And since it needs to follow us specifically, let's uncheck all players. While we're at it, let's go ahead and plug our attach to actor to the level loaded and then to the matinee. And we're going to want the matinee to loop upon completion. This ensures that our external camera is always in control until we say otherwise. Okay, so now go ahead and attach the target of attach to actor to our player. Now the camera that's going to control our top-down view doesn't exist yet, so we're going to need to create it in the level. And to do this, go to the content browser, tab over to actor classes, and select the camera actor, and add it to the level. You do this by right-clicking anywhere on your map, and from the context menu, select Add Camera Actor here. Back in our Kismet view, we can now create a variable from this camera actor by right-clicking the new object variable using camera actor. In attach to actor, drag attachment to the camera, because the camera is going to follow us wherever we go. So we're done with the first part of our Kismet setup, and now we need to choose a game type. As a reference of a game type that already has a rigged up player with a skeleton and animations, I'm going to choose the Unreal UT game type, which is also going to serve as an important lesson for how to set up our player if we decide that we want it rigged and animated with skeletal animations. First, let's see what happens by default when we test our map. We're still in first-person view. There's nothing wrong with this, so don't worry. That's because we still need to set up the matinee portion of our Kismet. Now typing behind view in the console gives us an over-the-shoulder view. Once we've set up our new camera, we can do something far more direct in Kismet using hotkeys, and later even toggle between multiple views. So, onto what might seem like the most intimidating part of our setup, and that's the matinee. And it's not really all that bad. We need three things. The first is a camera group, which is going to point to our existing camera. Then we need another group which represents the object that we want to look at. This can be called anything you like, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to call it look. Finally, we'll need a director group. And what the director group does is it tells our matinee sequence which camera we're going to be looking through. Now let's go ahead and close the matinee temporarily. As we can see when we created the camera group, because we had the camera selected in our level, it's gone ahead and created a variable for us. A good practice in Kismet for organization's sake and to help track down bugs is to only use one instance of a variable if at all possible. So if it creates another variable, delete it and reattach the new camera group to our existing camera variable. Then attach the look group to our player variable. In our matinee's properties, we're going to want to set rewind on play. And that's just one of those things that helps make sure it behaves properly. Now we can reopen matinee. Keyframing a camera's movement in matinee is traditionally predefined. We're going to change the keyframing behavior so it's completely dynamic. The first step to making the camera behave dynamically is to set the look at group name. This name should be exactly the same as the group we have set up below the camera group. Then further down the properties, for rotation mode, instead of IMR keyframed, select IMR look at group. The last step is to make sure that the director group is using the camera that we want. I can't emphasize enough how often people miss this. If we close our matinee and test the level, as it is now, you can see our camera isn't working yet. One simple keyframe is the difference between this functioning or not functioning. And let's add that keyframe. First we have to select the director group, and add the keyframe, then select the camera group. Again, close matinee, and we'll test our level one more time. Our external camera now functions, but the angle is entirely wrong. That's the next step we need to solve, but as you can guess, we're getting pretty close. The attach to actor node in Kismet has some properties that we can adjust, fortunately. The most relevant is the relative offset. In Unreal, the Z-axis controls up and down movement. So a value of 500, for example, would put our camera about 500 units above our player. But nothing's happening yet. That's because we need to check the box to use the relative offset. And there's probably one more thing we should do just to make sure things go smoothly. Let's right-click our camera and go to Camera Actor Properties. For location, X, Y, and Z should all be set to 0. In practice, when we set use camera offset, these should be overridden anyway, but sometimes properties can interact in ways we can't predict, and we may inadvertently be adding or subtracting from the values that we had originally intended. This is especially true as we add blocks of Kismet together. So let's check that use relative offset and test our level again. And now look at that, we have a top-down camera. But, and believe me, there's always a but. Our view was just going ballistic, and here's why. Because we have one offset axis defined, we also therefore have one rotation defined. The dynamic camera keyframing in our matinee is trying to decide how to interpolate between one iteration and the next. Now because the player's rotation is always changing, even if it's ever so slightly, the camera will get confused which way to rotate if it's directly above. Therefore, all it takes is a slight adjustment on the x-axis, that is forwards and backwards of the character, and even a value of -10 should do. As you might have noticed, I also increased our z value, and at this height we still maintain the impression that we're directly above. Now there are still a couple of kinks left to work out. One is a result of the skeletal movement, and the other I believe is in the matinee sequence itself. Now that portion was purely demonstrational, and in reality you're probably not going to want to use the Unreal Tournament game types, so let's select UDK game, which is more neutral and tends to behave the same as many of the other game types. And test once again. We are very, very close to where we want to be here, and there's an ever so slight glitch that's probably going to be imperceptible on a video that I'm recording at 10 frames per second. I believe that the matinee is responsible for that, so let's open that back up. If you encounter any small camera glitches, the best thing to do is double check your keyframes, make sure that the camera movement keyframe is pointed at the correct group, and also shorten your matinee sequence as much as possible. And you can do that with these little selectors at the bottom. I normally like to make mine about 0.1 seconds. But my ultimate suspicion in this case is that it's the position of the director group's keyframe, and that should be buttered right up to the beginning of the matinee sequence. Then we'll just trim this down as much as we possibly can. And I think that should do it. Let's go ahead and close and test again. Move around. Everything seems to be functioning nice and smoothly. And you can go ahead and add some geometry around your level now. You can add some enemies. We can rotate our camera. Basically, it works perfectly, and the only thing that would make this better is to actually be able to see our character, and that's what the other attached to actor node that I had originally was for. So I'll soon supplement this KismetKit block with an add-on that adds that functionality. So here's our final sequence, and it's really pretty simple looking, isn't it? We'll be back soon with more KismetKit blocks of all kinds.